Alright, so this week brings us to these two, and I'd been looking for an excuse to talk about Kiss Kiss Bang Bang for a while, since I already talked about The Nice Guys when it came out, and then these two came up when I did one of those Google searches of what's a movie like Kiss Kiss Bang Bang, just to see which ones came up. And Lucky Number Slevin was one of the first, and it kind of made sense immediately in a way where it's kind of like they both have the sort of wise ass main character that gets into these situations that he probably shouldn't have been in the first place until, in some cases, when other stuff is revealed. It might not be that simple, but and they're kind of seeming to want to both like striving to recapture the sort of back and forth like banter dialogue that you would see in like the 30s and 40s and stuff like that, whether it be out of old movies or out of old novels or whatever, like detective novels. It seemed like they were both kind of trying to emulate that in a certain way, and of course they came out in back-to-back years, with Kiss Kiss Bang Bang being in 2005, and Lucky Number 11 the following year, 2006, I think. Because I saw Lucky Number 11 in theaters. Kiss Kiss Bang Bang kind of snuck up on me, and I think everybody else. It was at a time where I was going to Hollywood Video like every week, and they started handing out like these pamphlets of the movie. It had like a whole calendar of the movies that were coming out, and at the time I didn't pay as close attention when stuff was actually coming out like in theaters, so I did not know of its existence at all until it was in like this pamphlet that said it was coming out. And so I was like, all right, I'll just snatch that up with the other new releases of that week, and was practically blown away by how like clever and original and fresh that it felt. Especially since this was 3 years before Iron Man, where it would turn out that there was the way Downey plays this Tony Stark character, and now people are saying like that's pretty much his actual personality. Now, either he or the character possess the other, and they're all in one now. But 3 years prior to that, he did play Harry Lockhart in a sort of similar way, obviously, but obviously at the time of Kiss Kiss Bang Bang, it was like a brand new thing, it felt like. Something like a sort of character that we didn't really expect to see from this actor at that particular time, because this was like, because Iron Man, obviously, and Tropic Thunder, both coming out in 2008, is considered his comeback, but I always felt like this was kind of the real start of his comeback, once people actually started seeing it. And, yeah, and then, of course, Zodiac was with him as well, but, yeah, it is. We should probably start off by saying it usually goes without saying in the whole versus segment, but for movies like this, especially Lucky Number 11, that relies so heavily on this, I feel like I should probably go ahead and say that we are going to talk about everything, like all the spoilers and stuff like that. So if you haven't seen either one of these, especially Lucky Number 11, this video would totally ruin pretty much everything the movie stands for you. So I would leave if that's the case. So talking about the two of these, and as far as who they come from, Kiss Kiss Bang Bang comes from a more sort of familiar place, despite the fact that it's the director's directorial debut, but that director happens to be Shane Black, who is known for writing stuff like Lethal Weapon and The Longest Goodnight and The Last Boy Scout and stuff like that, Last Action Hero. And Shane Black is one of those writers, like before he started directing, where it was like, even though a different director often took on his scripts, like how like McTiernan did Last Action Hero, Rennie Harlan did Longest Goodnight, Tony Scott did The Last Boy Scout, and Richard Donner did Lethal Weapon, it's still somehow it comes through. It's sort of like the stuff you can see Taylor Sheridan doing today, where it's like, even though each movie had a different director, you can tell a Shane Black written movie just by looking at it, which takes a really big writer to be able to pull off. And this kind of felt like something that was, the writing totally matches, but the directing style was like all his own thing. It felt like it didn't feel at all like the other movies that were based off, or that were had his scripts. So going into that, it is like, at the same time it does feel like he's sort of subverting himself when he made this, because it's like, it obviously talks about all the tropes and the cliches and stuff like that, and then has Harry narrating to call those things out. It's like, it's a lot of the stuff that you see in some of his earlier stuff, like Lethal Weapon or The Longest Goodnight or whatever. obviously he has been in the he went very much into the self-deprecation thing and the self-referential thing with Last Action Hero, to the point that that's like the entire movie. That's the entire movie's point. But he's able to do that with Kiss Kiss Bang Bang while also kind of telling his own story. Also, like it's a movie that I can really compliment in a way that I don't know I can compliment Lucky Number 11 in the same way, which is it's not necessarily defined by that thing. Where I think Lucky Number 11 in regards to its style and the fact that most of it is based on it, it's like the foundation of it is its twist. I do think there's like a whole like actual good detective story in this thing. It just has all the different lines that are like constantly, subverting what the genre typically does. But when it does fall into those, that's usually where like a sort of satire kind of thing falls flat. When it starts to like become the thing it's trying to do a satire on. But the thing is you can get past that and still make something good if you fall into that trap. If you're actually telling a good story, also, where it actually has like some truly like shocking reveals in it, with the comedy constantly there. Like it really rarely ever actually changes its tone, and when it does, it's really brief, and he's always able to catch himself to put it in there at just the right time before it kind of falls into the trap of becoming something that it didn't start off as and starts to become what it was essentially making fun of. Which I really, because that seems to happen almost every time, even in movies that are genuinely good, usually end up falling into that trap. But this one like avoids it. It avoids it like the plague, but at the same time feels like it's just barely on the line also. But when all's said and done and you see everything the movie had up its sleeve, then it feels like, oh no, he was totally in control of this the whole time. And that can seem really interesting because of just how far the movie goes into like practically parody of the whole sort of noir thing, but it doesn't do it in like. I mean, sometimes it can be very like it's a movie that might be. I can imagine people being very annoyed with it the first time they see it. And it's like, because you get, as an example, you have the giant robot thing. When we introduce Michelle Monaghan, he's talking about, oh, she's here because of the giant robot, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. And it's like, it's a movie that definitely benefits from having been seen more than once or multiple times over. When you know exactly what the whole giant robot thing is, but it's like, when it sets up that stuff at the start, it'd probably be really easy to kind of get fed up with it pretty quickly and say, like, this is trying way too hard to be clever. Something that one might say a lot during Lucky Number 11 also. And I am saying, like, here's a lot of stuff that it does great that Lucky Number 11 does, maybe not so well, but we are going to definitely get into the good stuff about Slevin as well. But to focus on Kiss Kiss Bang Bang by itself for a little bit, we do have... I was talking about Downey, and basically his character being that sort of, wisecracking narrator and all that, and talking about how the dialogue, when you're seeing it, like, for the first time, does really run the risk of, like, though they're trying so hard to be clever, and are they pulling it off, or are they not? And I think it works here the same way it works in Slevin, even though I do think Slevin falls into that category much more often than Kiss Kiss Bang Bang does, of it feels like the dialogue's trying way too hard. Because you get stuff in Slevin, like Lucy Liu saying, I'm short for my height, when Hardnett says, you're not as tall as I imagined. And it's... I kind of hate that one, and I don't think it works. You can tell it's trying to be clever, like they're kind of trying to do between Hartnett and Lucy Liu, like the Humphrey Bogart, Lauren Bacall kind of back and forth and stuff, like The Big Sleep. But it just doesn't quite have that same ring. But you can tell how hard they're trying, and it almost kind of makes it worse for that. But in these moments where Kiss Kiss Bang Bang ultimately is able to find their stride in that, and Slevin does find both its ups and downs in it, the reason they both work, and both of them don't crash and burn and look like they're trying too hard in the long run, is because of the charm of the leads. Like, the dialogue ultimately carries itself and works because most of it's coming from Downey, and the same can be said for Josh Hartnett in Slevin. where like his charm just really helps the movie find its stride, and then it's makes it much like when we get down to like the second half of it, then it's like you kind of stop worrying about whether or not it's trying too hard, and you're able to just sort of go with it by that point. Like I said, I do think Kiss Kiss Bang Bang hooks you in much quicker, because there is a back and forth. Both movies have a back and forth, where we have Downey and Kilmer in this. We have Josh Hartnett and Lucy Liu here, and technically there's kind of three going on if you throw Michelle Monaghan into it, but it's like she's kind of like you take Kilmer in this and you take Michelle Monaghan in this and combine them, and that's pretty much they've given both those parts to Lucy Liu in Slevin, so she has a lot more to carry with a character that sometimes works and sometimes not so much. But what really comes through here is the back and forth between Downey and Kilmer, because the thing about Gay Perry as a character, and it's obviously first and foremost the brilliant Kilmer performance, but the great thing about Gay Perry here also is that you would think between the two characters there should be more, like on paper there would be more of a contrast if Downey was doing the comedic role that he's doing and Kilmer was playing it totally straight. But the thing is while, interestingly enough, Gay Perry's played as like a very straightforward character, we'll say, for lack of, to take confusion out of this. It seems like it would be better suited if he was more not comedic. And the fact that they also make Gay Perry a comedic character in his own way, you'd think there would be a clash here. That there would be two characters that are supposed to be contrasting because of the two worlds they come from. One much more serious than the other in regards to their demeanor and the way they handle things. But they're both comedic characters. And you would think they'd be like... It's like when you have two comedic characters without one playing it straight, you would think there'd be like... it'd almost be like a one-up battle, like which character can be funnier. And then we'd end up reaching a bunch of dead ends and the contrast wouldn't be there and then the chemistry wouldn't be there because of that. But there's something in the brilliance of both the character and Kilmer's performance that the chemistry does work there. Like, they're both, like, the wisecracking dude, but the back and forth works so well, and the way they trade bars with each other works so well. And it becomes less of... Like, it's not a contrast of there's somebody that is a comedic character and somebody that's a straight character, but instead it's... They're both comedic characters, but one is typically really smart and knows what he's doing, and the other is the exact opposite of that. Has no idea what he's doing, should not be involved with this whatsoever, and it often finds himself in slapstick situations, even in a movie like this. And I think that's another great thing the movie does as far as its balance goes, where it's like there is a battle of tones there for a little bit, but it's always with a purpose, because you have stuff like, obviously you know, calling out stuff in the genre and stuff we've seen before, where it talks about like when he stops the scene when we're introduced to like Harlan Dexter and his daughter, and then it's like he just stops the scene and he says, well, that scene, you know, had absolutely no purpose. Like, you're thinking, oh, that's going to come back somehow, which of course it's one of the most crucial scenes in the movie, of course. But I also think that's like it's always finds this way of calling out something and then doing that, but expanding on it, and I think that's what ends up making that work. There is a brilliant example of this that I love that this movie does, where, like, talking about how it's able to make fun of something and then do that thing, but it ends up making the movie better when they fall into the same cliche, or maybe not so cliche, because there is a scene towards the beginning where they make fun of the gratuitous nudity in horror movies, and it's just for a split second. It's when Harry goes to that club and he meets that girl, and we get a flash of what she does, and she's in horror movies showing her tits and getting decapitated, and it lasts for like a fraction of a second. And then much later in the movie, like towards the end of the movie really, there is a pretty crucial, prolonged nude scene in this movie with Michelle Monaghan. And the interesting thing is, after at the beginning, they make fun of gratuitous nudity in movies that has nothing to do with anything and it's just there to be there. This Michelle Monaghan nude scene interestingly enough, progresses the plot and is extremely crucial because it triggers Harry's memory of the corpse not wearing underwear, which is a massive clue that takes us to the climax of the movie. And it's like the way they were like to really, totally, completely subvert that after calling it out at the beginning. That's the kind of stuff that makes the satire of this movie so magical. And how they're able to take that stuff and just, like I said, the way he builds on his own story with that stuff is amazing and like so like well thought out. But talking about some of the tonal shifts, where he still always manages to find his way back. Like, there is the turning point when Harry eventually kills somebody in a pretty cold-blooded fashion. When the pink-haired girl, Shannon Sossaman, is killed, and Harry witnesses this up front. Like, he's been dealing with corpses. It's like the first time he deals with a corpse. Actually, the first 2 times he deals with the same corpse. The scenes are very funny and very slapstick heavy. There's like a whole, it's like a whole, like, it feels like a whole classic, very dark, like, classic slapstick routine. Like if it wasn't so dark, something you would see in, like, a Marx Brothers movie, when they're trying to get rid of this body, and they throw it down, hoping it'll land in the dumpster, and it misses and hits it, hits the side of it. Just, like, really over-the-top slapstick, and then him pissing on the corpse. It's like a whole thing, this scene. And then that is eventually backed up by the scene where he thinks Michelle Monaghan has killed herself, which is a genuine moment, but still balances it out, where Perry has to try to be human and comfort him, but then say, "I gotta go, and you're leaning on my car, I need to just shove you to the side so I can drive off." And then, we're talking about this scene where he kills the guy that killed the pink-haired girl, and it's like this really serious moment and this huge turning point. But number one, it's balanced out because the very next scene is the dog taking his finger, which is like, once again, it's like a very dark version of a scene you'd see in a kid's movie or something. Very dark version of that. And there's like that balance after he has the remorse and like the dog comforts him, that he comes to terms with the fact that he's killed somebody, and you're like, well, that's, you know, weirdly dark and like a weird tonal shift, but alright, especially with the dog running around with the finger and all that. But it's actually setting up the climax, because you have that thing in movies when characters that really shouldn't be in certain situations get into those situations, and by the end of the movie they're shooting people because it's an action movie. And it keeps occurring to you, like, that person kills people awfully easily for just being a normal person, like, a couple of days ago. So this whole scene where he has the turning point where he kills somebody for the first time, then deals with it, is really just setting up the action climax to where where we've passed that. So now Harry can just kill whoever the hell he wants in this climax, and we're like, yeah, he's been through this, so he can do this now. He can become an action hero for like 30 seconds. And it works, and we don't think about it because they actually set it up. And there's so much of that in this movie, where there's like so much setup, and you're not quite sure when. And obviously sometimes it's blatantly obvious, and maybe crossing that line a little bit, where maybe it's trying to be just a little too clever for its own good. But still, whenever those payoffs come, it's like it all sort of makes sense, and it all feels like it's, yeah, just this nice puzzle that comes together. It just happens to have like this sort of comedic edge to it in the process. And even when you throw in like the last scene with Perry and Harmony's dad, where it's like this payoff to these scenes in the opening, when we see them in like their childhood. Also worth noting, the young version of Harmony in the box in the very first scene in the childhood flashback is Ariel Winter from Modern Family, which I didn't know for a really long time, and then it just dawned on me one of the times I was watching it. And yeah, the way they bring all this back, and the way they kind of do the whole thing where Harry's not like the smooth guy you would expect, and like when you see these noir stories, and it's like the guy like has women always just drawn to him, and then that just turns into a whole thing. And while he still, you know, sleeps with people occasionally, we get multiple scenes of him approaching a girl at a party, like the horror movie girl, or the first time he meets Flicka, and he's talks to them for like a second, and then they just leave, and they're just like, all right, well, I'm gonna go do something else. And it's like, and it's not even like they're rejecting him. It's just like it's part of the conversation. It's like, well, we've spoken for 2 seconds. Goodbye. And it's like not only is it setting up, you know, the whole cliche of no, if one character gets at least one close up in a like a noir story or a detective story, they're probably eventually going to be important in some way, or at least come back in one way or another. Um, but also playing up the fact that Harry is not like the smooth hero you see in stories like this also. So it's doing like double duty with like 10 seconds of screen time. Means like multiple things throughout it. And sometimes they're comedic and sometimes they serve the story, and it's great. And I also like that the movie's not afraid to go into the bizarre at times. Like there are some things in this movie that just feel flat out weird. Uh, and they just kind of go for it. The whole thing, when he loses his finger in the door, is so fucking over the top and out of nowhere. And like they that's the thing too, is it's so over the top and out of nowhere, but they treat it nonchalantly, which is what ends up making it work. And actually causes a problem here and there. And it's like it's not entirely gratuitous, but even if it was, we'd almost admire it for just how far it goes. And then there's the whole thing about how, like, everybody has a gun and is so willing to use it. Where we have the other guy that's trying to kill them that gets killed by the guy at the food stand who has a gun, just like that, with no problem. And then there's the opening scene that separates Harry from his partner that sets the whole story off, because this woman who sticks her head out the window has a gun that she's not afraid to use at all. And it's just throwing in characters like that. Just gives it like this really sort of unpredictable feel that feels really refreshing. So, yeah, and I do think that it does... like, there are maybe one too many scenes of them, like a character will say a line and then two characters argue whether that line works or not. There's a lot of scenes like that, and that's another time where it feels like I think they're trying a little too hard to do the... Everybody's trying to be serious, but also they're funny and bumbling, and then yeah. And it's... But like I said, the stuff with, like, you know, Harry and Perry does work with the way, like, he tries to do the thing that Harmony pulled on him, where it's the correct use of bad and badly, and that just backfires right in his face. And just any time the two of them are on screen together and having to take care of a problem, are like some of the real high points of the movie. And like I said, they really combine their chemistry with like classic slapstick and all that other stuff, and just really make it work in this really, really funny way. I think that's what makes the movie work the most, is quite simply it's just hilarious, and that's a lot of it. So, and like I said, but it does have an actual story with like an actual sort of poignant ending to where you can tell that it wasn't entirely defined by that style of being comedic or being satire or being wisecracking or whatever. There's actually like a real story in it, with like a really heartbreaking conclusion also, with the whole subplot with her sister, or not subplot because they all eventually connect. So, yeah, so I've always just really loved this movie. It was one of those movies also where, like, even though when I saw it, because I was still probably like 14 or so when I saw it, so I didn't catch like everything, but there was just something about its style that I knew I was watching something that was like, that just felt really new and fresh. And especially the Downey performance really made it stand out and really made him somebody that I was ready to watch in pretty much any role 3 years before he got the role of his life, really. So, yeah, so everything about that. So we've touched on Lucky Number Slevin here and there while talking about that. And, yeah, and I was talking about how we got Shane Black here, who is a writer we recognize, even when he's not directing the movie, but then as a director was really kind of able to show off his own thing. Which is interesting because here we do have a director with some experience, who was the director of... He's done a number of things, but I think most notably he found some... He did the fairly acclaimed Gangster #1, which also was a story that kind of jumped around in a similar fashion that this one does. And the writer is a guy that is a bit of a mystery, because he wrote this movie, but as far as movies go, I don't think he wrote anything else movie-wise until War Dogs. Which is a really big gap. It's 10 years, exactly. But he also went on to create a couple of shows like Kidnapped with Timothy Hutton, and he did My Own Worst Enemy, the Christian Slater show. Both those shows, of course, were like short-lived for one season. And so it's a kind of a bizarre list of credits. And when this movie opens, because you talk about Kiss Kiss Bang Bang getting you right at the start with the opening, with Ariel Winter in the box and the screaming and all that. But here, you kind of start a bit worried because when this movie begins, it does have a very like straight to video feel, a very rocky start. But that's not to take too much away from it, because when I say that, what I really just mean is the opening credits. Feel very straight to video and very choppy, and the editing is like really obnoxious. There's a lot of gunshots that seem totally, gratuitous just to be jarring and say, hey, we're hooking the audience or whatever. But it snaps itself out of that pretty quickly, especially when it becomes more apparent exactly what's going on in these scenes. Because I think what they were trying to do is make the scenes a bit disorienting so you remember them, but it's blurry to you as to what could they possibly mean, because eventually those mysteries will be revealed. But in the process of trying to pull that off, it's just a really obnoxious, choppy, straight-to-video opening. But then it snaps itself out of it with this opening scene involving this family with the dude and the gambler and the kid and all that. And then that opening, the pacing for this movie, I think really stands out too. Because obviously movies like this tend to be pretty fast-paced, but I mean, in particular with this, you don't really realize that, this opening scene is going to be crucial. These opening scenes are going to be crucial with the father that's the gambler. But they're so well done and so snappy that you don't even realize this opening is nearly 20 minutes long before we even see Josh Hartnett's face. And it's obviously one of those cases, like Downey was talking about in Kiss Kiss Bang Bang, we're introduced to this, and then we cut to something that seems totally and completely different and on a totally different page in a totally different time period, and we're like, oh, will those things connect? I wonder. And it does suffer a little bit, because, well, here's the thing, I don't remember, because I would have been 15 or so when this came out in theaters, 15 or 16. And I remember the twist being a really big deal. Like, the twist, I think, is why most people love the movie as much as they do. But when you watch it back now, like, I'm trying to figure out if I had seen it for the first time today, after seeing so many more movies do this style so many more times, if it's as obvious as it seems. Because I hadn't seen the movie, I probably hadn't seen the movie in over a decade when I watched it, the most recent time I watched it. And I felt like I didn't remember much of anything about the movie, but as soon as it started, the pieces of the puzzle feel so obvious. Like, it's almost like even the kid in the opening scenes even looks like Josh Hartnett at certain angles and, like, profile shots. But even so, it still manages, the important thing is that it's able to snap itself out of that, straight-to-DVD feel and give us this really, this opening that actually does pull you in, and then also gives us the first time we see Bruce Willis, when he's having the conversation with this guy in the airport and just having that dialogue with him. And I do feel like with Willis, this is one of those, because obviously this is probably around the time Willis started, like, phoning in, like, all of his performances. Like I said, maybe Looper aside. But I feel like when Bruce Willis shows up in all these straight-to-DVD movies that he's doing now, it's this style of Bruce Willis that I think those directors are looking for. Because you could say it looks like he might be phoning it in this, but I think what Willis does here that's so great, and maybe he liked this character so much he just got stuck in it for the last 14 years, but that whole sort of, like, blank expression, like that sort of emotionlessness that he has, like, is what the character is. Where, like, he's this killer that's really, and as he keeps popping up throughout the story, it becomes so unpredictable. His first scene in itself, the whole point of his opening scene is how unpredictable it is. Because it's like, you look one way, and then this thing's actually happening. And it's genuinely jarring when he kills the dude, because it just catches you so off guard. And then it's like, when it goes from there, that character, especially the more that's revealed about him, especially towards the end, the fact that he's so emotionless actually makes his character more poignant when those scenes come up, and what his history is, especially with Slevin. And, so I felt like that was really well done, even though it's easy to dismiss it as like, you know, oh, another Willis performance that's like that. But I think he suits the role perfectly. It is, yeah, really, even before we go on to anything else, the cast list in this thing is fucking insane. You have two crime bosses that are going after the same, very similar objectives, Morgan Freeman and Ben Kingsley. And apparently there was controversy behind the fact that he's actually credited as Sir Ben Kingsley in the opening credits. Apparently that was not Kingsley's call, despite popular belief. It was like, apparently somebody at the studio fucked up. And thought, apparently they thought like that's what you were supposed to do or something. But then a lot of people said like, oh my god, that Kingsley's so fucking pretentious. But it's like, no, that wasn't Kingsley's call. But then you go into it and you see, and like I said, you have Lucy Liu. And I would say I do, I think the Lucy Liu character is kind of hard to latch onto at first, I think, because it almost seems too convenient how quickly she gets involved in everything. And there's a lot of that stuff in this movie where it's like how quickly Slevin gives up trying to convince people that he's not Nick Fisher feels pretty, like, just, you know, abrupt. Well, once again, though, when you look at the whole setup, obviously it's eventually going to make sense and all that, but with that stuff, the stuff where Slevin isn't, you know, trying harder to convince them he's not who he says he is, that makes sense after all the reveals. Lucy Liu really wanting to get involved in this so quickly and involved with him so quickly, maybe not so much. I don't know. Maybe it's the towel flash is the explanation, but I don't know. But then you kind of stop worrying about that, and the charm of her character does sort of win you over, sort of in the same way it wins him over. And so, like, you have the scene when they decide they're going to go on a dinner date, and she moves towards him before she leaves. And it's like, are they going to hug? Are they going to kiss? And she just literally says, never mind, and leaves. And it's like, stuff like that, with a worse actress will probably seem like forced, sort of like quirkiness or something like that. Something really irritating. But Lucy Liu really actually makes it work. And she's kind of an unexpected casting choice to make that work. And I don't know if it's just because I have her, you know, tougher roles on the brain or what. But yeah, and so I was basically able to, and the fact that she pretty much shares that charm I was talking about that Josh Hartnett has that carries the movie, and that makes their chemistry work a little more. I do think it's probably a setback that there is a lot of dialogue in this movie where, and this is the kind of thing that always drives me crazy. Dialogue that's like an overabundance of references to other things. And it's like, I like the chemistry between Josh Hartnett and Lucy Liu, but it feels like 90% of their dialogue together is talking about Bond movies. Which just feels like really... And I feel like it's supposed to humanize their dialogue, but the more they go on and on about the one thing, it feels less like the characters interacting for real, and that's the way they talk about their similar interests. And more of just like the writer trying to show off how much he knows about Bond. And it starts to come through in that way. And then later on when Kingsley starts talking about North by Northwest, and it's like, it's just dialogue that's just almost nothing but references, just feels so lazy. And it's like I said, just like the writer trying to show off like how much he knows about certain things. Doesn't matter whether it suits the character or not. And Kingsley's saddled with some not-so-great dialogue, just kind of in general. There's the moment at the end when he and Freeman wake up tied to each other, and he's awoken from unconsciousness, and the very first thing he does, barely with his eyes open, it starts monologuing in analogies. And it's like, it's times like that where the movie kind of feels like it's trying a little too hard to do the clever dialogue thing. And it's like, yeah, with Kiss Kiss Bang Bang, you had the stuff where they were pointing out, like, the random people that look like different versions of celebrities. That felt a lot more in line with the real conversations you'd have with people when you're, like, observing. Not so much the endless Bond references in the North by Northwest scene. And I feel like there's a bunch of others also. But that shows how far the chemistry between Hartnett and Lucy Liu goes. That's what I'm trying to say. And the dialogue kind of becomes, you know, sort of reliant on that. But I got sidetracked. I was talking about the cast. We also obviously have Stanley Tucci here, who is a character that has some pretty last-minute reveals that I don't know entirely work, as well as some of the other reveals. And you also have Corey Stoll in like a really early role. I was kind of last time I watched this, I was jarred to see him in the opening credits, and I was like, he was around in 2006. I barely remember him pre Midnight in Paris. But yeah, he's been around at least 5 years prior to that. Um, yeah, so it's one of those cases where you can go back and the cast is more recognizable than you even remembered. I completely forgotten Tucci was a major character, and he's listed on the cover. Uh, and yeah, so assembling this cast was going to do this movie a lot of favors. And you can see it being one of those, dialogue-heavy movies. Whether the dialogue always works or not, makes you can attract a cast like this with scripts like this still. And I do think that does go a long way. And I was talking about, like, the pacing. And I think another reason that makes the pacing work so well is I was talking about the first 20 minutes being just that whole sort of, not necessarily flashback scene, but like the backstory scene that's going to eventually set up all the reveals later. And then there's another portion of this movie. Like, the movie itself is basically an hour with the beginning and the end between it. And when I say that, obviously that's how the structure of movies, but I mean specifically these chunks of the movie that you can separate as this is the events they're setting up. The last 25 minutes is the entire reveal. Because when you think about reveals, usually it's like the last 5 minutes when it's like, oh, this thing, and then I'll bet you didn't catch this, and then it's pretty much over. But the ending reveal, like, we're talking about I heard there's a lot of comparisons to The Usual Suspects when it comes to, like, the twist and how it's revealed and just how much of it completely reshapes the rest of the movie. And so, in The Usual Suspects, the reveal is like, what, a minute or two of Chaz Palminteri having the epiphany as he's reading everything. The big reveal of the twist in Slevin is the entire last almost half an hour. It is nearly a half an hour of reveals. So, you look at that, and you immediately have to call into question the same question a lot of people threw at The Usual Suspects, the people that didn't like The Usual Suspects as much as the fans did, which was, how good is a movie that relies that much on the power of just its twist? And it's like, so... but, as The Usual Suspects proved, to most people, because there is that thing, because the twist is the thing that you leave the movie with. Like, you can watch, a movie that's just, maybe you're even indifferent to. Just something really just average and mediocre or whatever. But if it's got an amazing twist, that's what you leave the movie with, and you leave the movie in your mind that the entire movie is amazing. Especially if it's able to reshape that mediocrity. But it's like, I guess rewatchability factor would come into this quite a bit, because it's like, if you can go back and watch the movie again and it becomes an entirely different movie, without the surprise factor, is the quality going to be there? Or is it going to be like, even, because you can have like a one-shot movie where it's like, everything is mediocre until the twist, and you're like, okay, I left on that high, so the movie's good because of one scene. But then there's also you go back and you're like, oh, now I noticed this thing and this thing and this thing. But then, can the movie be watched again after that, is the question. Like, can it survive a third viewing? Once you learn what's going on, you watch it not knowing what's going on, then you learn what's going on and it reshapes the movie. Then, after you get through the novelty of that, you go back a third time and it's like, okay, now is the movie good or not? Or is it just the theatrics of it? When in underlying, it's just, there's not much there. I think, after all that build-up, I think Slevin kind of transcends that. Because the reveals are so much. Because the reveals are such a massive part of the movie. Because it's not just, it's a movie, and then for 5 minutes you're like, oh, it's not what I thought it was, the end. It is such a significant portion of the movie, those reveals happening. It's an entire chunk of it that makes it like a whole other monster, and sort of makes it something totally different in regards to the Twist movie, which is really interesting. And yeah, maybe that's the reason that it all seems so obvious to me watching it again, even over a decade later, is because it's such a because it's the whole, like, it's not even just the twist isn't just the story turning it on its head. The twist is the story itself, because it's so big and so elaborate and such a big portion of the movie. I hope something in here is coherent or makes sense or what. But yes, I do really admire that about the movie, and I do think it has a decent, if familiar, plot going on when it's not that. The whole pitting the, bosses against each other and stuff like that. And you've Morgan Freeman in here in this really interesting sort of threatening performance in a way that we hadn't seen too often up to this point. Then it kind of felt like he sort of revisited and won it a couple of years later. So yeah, so it really just makes you think about the whole twist thing and how much a twist makes a movie. Or if it's all just sort of fireworks to distract you from nothing is that particularly great about it, but then if they just put one thing in it that blows your mind, it changes your opinion of the entire movie. Which may hide some flaws in the movie. So, yeah. So it's like, and that begs the question also, it's like, can you go back and watch The Usual Suspects multiple times knowing it's just a bunch of Spacey's bullshit? Just reading off the walls and coming up with shit off the top of his head. It's like, yeah, we can. Because the characters are strong, the dialogue is strong, and everything about it is just intriguing in this sort of way, in this particular style that the movie holds like as its own. And I do think Slevin can do that in its way also, where it does have enough characters, even like I said, the dialogue can be a bit, dodgy sometimes, but other times does work. But it's having people like Hartnett as this lead character and being able to totally pull that off, and Lucy Liu being equally charming, and then you got the crime bosses of Freeman and Kingsley, you got Tucci doing his thing, just all these people bouncing around, even like the little side characters every now and then, Michael T. Williamson and all those other guys coming in. So there is something there. And like I said, I did initially want to, criticize it for like, would people like it as much if it weren't for the fact that there's a giant twist? Like, do people like the rest of the movie as much as they like the twist, is the question. But like I said, when the twist is such a massive portion of the movie, and just becomes part of the story, then it's kind of a whole other monster. So that is incredibly admirable. And I do like the way it goes about that style. It kind of took the twist in like a new sort of different direction, at least as far as movies in this sort of area. It's almost kind of an unassuming movie at the start when you look at it and you just see it as like, it's just going to be some action movie or something. It is fun to see what all it has up its sleeve, even if, like I said, I don't know if the secrets seem so not well hidden at all when you're watching it back, but sometimes that happens with the best of them. So, yes. So, overall, I do think I significantly prefer Kiss Kiss Bang Bang. I've seen it many more times than I've seen Slevin, but after talking about it again, I might come back to Slevin a little more than I have before. But Kiss Kiss Bang, there was a time there where Kiss Kiss Bang Bang kind of came back around Christmas for me every few years or so. Like most Shane Black movies, it's not a Shane Black movie unless it's at Christmas or it's The Predator, but we won't worry about that. So I think that's going to be it for this. There's a couple of things that could be the next one. I'm not quite sure which of those it's going to be, but it'll be one of them. And then next week we're going to have, as far as reviews, we have like The Hunt and that Vin Diesel movie, whatever that is, and whatever else is there. But as I said before, I'm just worried about the week after. That's all I give a shit about. So until then, I think that's going to be it for this.